Peter said if I got my font much bigger on my Surface, I'd be able to just leave it sitting on the front pew. I was surprised he knew what a Surface was. So it's a new month and a new step. Came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. I used to hate this step. And the reason I hated it was that last word, sanity. I did not want to believe that I was insane. Insane people are in mental institutions and psych wards, and I was still wandering the street. But I want you now to think about all your various forms of insanity as I talk a little bit about some of mine. For me, my particular brand of insanity was drinking myself into oblivion night after night, having money for alcohol but not for utilities and other payments, a DUI, hiding bottles everywhere, the difficult task of bottle management, driving drunk with my kids in the car, not going home, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. What about things like telling myself that I could quit anytime, or that I was only going to have one drink? What about switching from liquor to beer or wine, or promising myself that I would only drink on the weekends? What about canceling appointments or family dinners or other events, or not answering my phone for days on end? All of that stuff was going on for me. In fact, it was just the tip of the iceberg. There was 10 times or 100 times more than that going on for me. But I did not want to admit that I was insane. No siree, not me, because I wasn't in a psych ward. But for me, where I'm at in my journey, this is now a step that I work on a lot. When I started letting go of my ego, or at least worked on getting it in check, I see so many ways that my thinking is still a little more than crazy. Things like overeating, not exercising, too much TV, not enough sleep, working too hard, no self-care, procrastination, taking on too much, lack of spiritual connection. All of that sounds like a little more than just a bit of insanity. And the reason I work this step a lot right now, as Peter said in his introduction, is that it's a foundation step. I need to rely on my higher power to restore my sanity every day, and sometimes many times a day. I can get so out of touch with reality so fast that I need to wake up or come to. I need to give my head a shake and restart. Sometimes my thinking gets so messed up that I have to phone my sponsor and ask him if my thinking is okay. Now think about this. How messed up is that? Pete's my sponsor. Our scripture tonight deals with inner bondage. It is from Mark 5, verses 3 to 5. And I'm going to give you a little bit of the backstory before we get into the scripture. Jesus was helping a man who was acting insanely. This man lived among the burial caves and could no longer be restrained, even with chains. And when I read this scripture, I was struck by how well it was describing what we are like when we're active in our addiction and acting insanely. The image of the burial caves is great because we are closer to death than we sometimes care to believe. Some of us wish that we could die, and some of us have been written off by friends and family, and to them we were all but dead. Now, whenever this man was put into chains and shackles, which he often was, he snapped the chains from his wrists and he smashed the shackles. And that's powerful imagery. If we're going to drink or use, go back to our insanity, there is nothing that is going to stop us. Day and night this man wandered among the burial caves and in the hills, and he was cutting himself with sharp stones. And again, the imagery, isolating and harming himself. Now, the scripture says, I think we're a little past where I want to be right now. That's the second part. Okay, I'm going to read from my Surface because I have the big font. Jesus went into the graveyard and assessed the situation. He dealt with the forces of darkness that were afflicting the man and restored him to sanity. So that is, came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. He then sent him home to his friends to tell him what God had done for him. So Jesus asked him to go home and do a little step 12 work. Now, we may have gone so far that we have broken all restraints. Maybe we have struggled to be free from the constraints of society and loved ones. All hope seems lost. But there is hope. There is one who has all power, and he can restore us to sanity. This study from the book of Mark in the Recovery Bible is titled Internal Bondage. And I was taken by that. And I was taken by that because there are so many examples of bondage in the Bible. Now, I titled my message tonight, Exodus. The word Exodus is from the Greek, and it means road or way. Our present-day definition is the departure of a large number of people. And I think that describes recovery exceptionally well. We are a large number of people departing a way of life that has absolutely been a form of bondage. Of course, Exodus is also the second book of the Bible, and it is the story of how the Israelites were led by Moses out of Egypt, where they were being held in slavery. Now, Moses had previously escaped from Egypt and slavery, and God had heard the cries of the people of Israel who were still enslaved as they came to believe that a power greater than themselves could do what they had been unable to do under their own power. And God sent Moses. Moses didn't believe that he could rise to the challenge, and he tried to get out of the responsibility. And when I thought about that, I thought that's probably much like we do when we're first asked to do service work or to be a sponsor. But God held Moses to the fire, literally, a burning bush. And Moses led the people from the house of bondage through the Red Sea and into the wilderness. Now, there are so many parts of Exodus that are rich with recovery analogies. Just for today is illustrated in Exodus when the Israelites were told they would receive food from God, but they were only to take what they needed for 24 hours. This taught them to trust in God for all their needs and to live one day at a time. They learned to trust Moses, but many of them didn't at first, pushing back, challenging, and complaining. And I don't know about you, but that sounds a lot like me when I was first in recovery. Being led into the wilderness is like what happens to us when we are freed from the bondage of our addiction. We are led into a land that is unfamiliar, and we have to learn to live a new way. So when people come to Recovery Calgary, one of the exercises that we give them on the first or second day is to write down what they want their life to look like in recovery. And the reason for that is that most of us start our drinking and using careers very early in our lives, and we've never learned how to live free from our substances. The Israelites didn't like the new way of life, and they complained bitterly. And at times they even wanted to go back into slavery, just the same way that we sometimes fight to keep our addiction, or that we will switch to a new addiction only to find ourselves enslaved again. But they hung on long enough, and the promises started to come true. Now, Peter hinted a few weeks ago that we're going to start to get a little more into stage 2 recovery, and that's where I'm going to venture a little bit tonight. So bear with me. The characteristics of slavery are no voice, no choice, heavily burdened, and controlled by others. Do those things sound familiar? No voice, no choice, heavily burdened, and controlled by others. They sound a bit like addiction. Can we have the other slide up there, Doug? They sound a bit like addiction, but, and this is a big but, I'm talking about how we are enslaved by our families of origin and other significant influences from our past. We're controlled by forces from our past that we can't or won't see unless we do stage 2 recovery work. Now I'm going to talk about cell phones in a minute, so that's really appropriate. So I want to be clear, not everyone is ready for stage 2 recovery work. You need to have substantial sobriety under your belt and be working a good program. Stage 2 recovery work is about excavating and looking for the underlying issues behind our addictions and our behaviors. Research shows us that people who relapse usually have endured significant trauma. And research also indicates that addiction is a subconscious attempt to medicate away the painful experiences of that trauma. I'm not discounting the genetic predisposition factor, but my experience has been in working with addicts for the last 10 or so years that there is almost always abuse or trauma lurking somewhere. Now, I'm not saying there isn't the unicorn out there somewhere, that person who grew up in the perfect family that ended up being an addict. I'm just saying that I haven't met them. Many of the ones who try to convince me that everything was rosy in their childhood end up finding out that they were just in denial. And I was one of those people. But until we break out of denial, we will stay in slavery. So remember what I said. Research shows us that people who relapse usually have endured significant trauma. So I want to stretch the thinking a bit here. Most of us would agree that if an alcoholic got sober and then started smoking crack, that they would have relapsed. Most of us would say that if a cocaine addict got clean and then started drinking, they would have relapsed. Dope is dope, and addiction is addiction. Addiction is a disease of escape. Its goal is to medicate, obliterate, or ignore reality. So assuming that I'm correct and that all the research is correct, and that addiction is about medicating away the painful experiences and not wanting to feel, I want you to consider the following things and see if they might just be relapse. How about things like watching TV for 6 hours every evening? How about overeating and gaining 20 or 30 or 50 pounds? How about watching pornography or gambling? How about being on Facebook or Instagram several hours per day? How about hours of gaming? How about checking your cell phone every 10 minutes for text messages or emails? How about overspending? What about surfing the internet for hours on end looking for that exclusive something that may just be out there? And here's the big one. How about unhealthy relationship after unhealthy relationship? Many of us do these things day in and day out, wasting countless hours of time that we could be spending on cultivating healthy relationships, taking a course to improve ourselves, upgrading our education, helping other people, etc., 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 or heaven forbid, seeking help from a professional to help us figure out why we keep doing the same stupid stuff over and over and over again. And then we complain that our life isn't going anywhere, that we can't catch a break, if only this or if only that. And we are so unconscious that we don't even know that the reasons we are doing these things and staying stuck in our own perpetual Groundhog Day is because we don't look at what is causing it. Now, this may come as a surprise to you, but by far the greatest number of people who come to me for counseling after they get clean and sober come to see me because their relationships are in a mess and they want me to fix that. I don't fix relationships. In fact, I don't work with couples. And the reason is this. Most coupleship problems are individual problems that are getting misread as coupleship problems. What I see is people who, A, don't know how to live sober. So remember my example from earlier. They've been drinking and using most of their lives. And then B, they decide they know how to be in a relationship 2 months or 6 months or a year after they've been sober. C, they likely grew up in a fairly dysfunctional family and therefore haven't had anything remotely healthy modeled for them. And D, they can't figure out why it's not working. Now, most people I work with come from a dysfunctional family and or have experienced massive trauma. They've been drinking and drugging for most of their lives. They have low self-esteem, inflated egos, money problems, don't know who they are, haven't done any work around any of this, and can't figure out why their relationship is in trouble or why they keep finding the wrong person. They are the wrong person. And I can speak about this because I was the wrong person. Now, if you are unhealthy and came from a dysfunctional family, you are most likely to find somebody just like you. Like attracts like. Or put another way, we're attracted to that with which we are familiar. And when you put dysfunction with dysfunction, you don't get dysfunction times 2, you get dysfunction to the 10th power. I hear people come to me and say, but you tell us to pray all the time, and I prayed for God to bring somebody into my life. And I prayed that prayer myself. And when that somebody came into my life, I don't know, God maybe has a bit of a sense of humor and sometimes doesn't give us what we want, but gives us what we need. So I said a few minutes ago that I'm qualified to speak on this because I was that guy. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my story here to let you know what my qualifications are, and they aren't book learning, I can tell you that. So I was married for 26 years to a woman who was dysfunctional in her own right, was sexually abused, came from an alcoholic family, and was physically abusive to me. Now, that shouldn't have come as a surprise to me because I grew up in a dysfunctional family with an alcoholic father and a mother who was physically abusive to me. But what happened is after I ended that marriage of 26 years, I went out and I wouldn't listen to people who had been in the program for longer than me. And 8 months into my sobriety, I decided, you know what? I need to be in another relationship. And I've gotten my picker all fixed now, so I can go out and pick a good one. So having my picker fixed, I go and look for somebody, that's with an I, my picker fixed. I go and look for somebody, guess where? In an AA meeting. So, yeah, good job. Somebody else has done this too, probably. So, this person is the person that I prayed for, or so I thought. I didn't think that I was ready. God knew that I wasn't ready, so he gave me somebody to prove that I wasn't ready. So this person was still drinking, was a prescription pill addict and still using that, was bulimic, had been sexually assaulted and spiritually abused when she was growing up. And unbelievably, she lied to me about all this stuff. Now, I don't know why that would happen, and I would find somebody like that in an AA room with only 8 months of sobriety. That took me on a roller coaster ride of about 13 months. Fortunately, God was still in the background, kind of having a little chuckle about, well, you wanted somebody, so, I've got bigger plans for you, so here you have it. 13 months later, finally I said, you know what? I got to get out of this mess, and I did. I ended the relationship. Now I'm really smart. So 11 months later, still with a rather damaged picker, I go out and find somebody else. And God, because I didn't pray for the right things, like knowledge of His will for me and the power to carry that out, was happy to oblige and gave me another dysfunctional person who had come from a dysfunctional family. Now this one, because I'm so brilliant by this time, don't you know it, because I've got a few years of sobriety under my belt at this time, but haven't done any of my stage 2 work, this one I decide, you know what, I think I see some problems here, but I'll fix that. I'll marry her. Yeah. So I married her. And 18 months later, after she had left me, Pete's chuckling down here, he's just hoping that I'm going to tell the U-Haul story. So 18 months later, I finally get out of that relationship. And I should have known 3 months into it that there was something really severely wrong with it, because I was home one day talking on the telephone to a friend of mine. I lived on an acreage at the time, and I looked out the window and I said, I think I better go because my wife just drove in the yard with a U-Haul truck. That's usually not a good sign. Now, the reason Pete's chuckling is I didn't know Pete at the time, and I didn't know that he was the guy that owned the U-Haul agency out in Airdrie, and he was renting my wife the truck so that she could come and move out on me. And he didn't know at that point in time either, but Pete's actually very wealthy because she kept renting U-Haul trucks and showing up and taking her stuff and coming back and showing up, taking her stuff. And this went on for 18 months before I finally got out of that relationship. So I looked at that. I grew up with an physically abusive mother. My wife of 26 years was physically abusive to me. The relationship that I got into between my wife of 26 years and my second wife was physically abusive to me. And my second wife was physically abusive to me. And I looked at those 3 relationships and I went, I think that I'm the common denominator. I think that this problem is about me, not about them. And that's when I really started to do my stage 2 recovery work. And that's when I started to recognize the fact, can you believe this? My mother's physically abusive, my first wife physically abusive, a relationship of 13 months the woman was physically abusive, and a relationship afterwards of 18 months of marriage the woman was physically abusive to me, because I hadn't looked at what was causing the problems for me. So remember, God gives us what we need, not what we want. Now I want to qualify this just a little bit. I don't want anybody going away thinking that I'm suggesting that people shouldn't be in recovery programs, that they just need to get a therapist. Recovery programs are great. Treatment facilities can help you get sober. 12-step meetings give us a new way of living. They get us to look at our part. They help us to clean up the wreckage and to find a new healthy way forward. They connect us to a community and get us into helping others and getting out of our own way. But it is just the start. And what does all this have to do with step 2? Well, I believe that we are just switching addictions, numbing out, and not doing the work. And that, my friends, is insanity.